Hey guys, Chris Connell here from Gorilla Filmmaker, and today I'm gonna show you how easy it is to summon a Keyblade and of course make a sick ground explosion using the amazing Make Big Films VFX platform. Let's take a look. How sick was that? Now guys, welcome to another Gorilla Filmmaker tutorial in collaboration with the amazing Make Big Films VFX platform, tailored to show you how to make amazing VFX scenes for your project in an easy, accessible, and super fun way. I will have their links to Make Big Films down in the description below for you to check it out. Now before we get started and fire up After Effects to edit our footage, I want to remind you about the three key rules that we need to keep in mind when approaching a project like this, and specifically when it comes to the production and filming of those VFX scenes. Number one is all about pre-planning your VFX scenes in advance to fit the VFX assets you have available. Number two, sometimes less is actually more, so try not to overcomplicate it during filming, whether that means about camera movements or other things you have going on at the same time as the visual effect takes place. Number three, always have fun and trust in the edit. Of course, if you want to learn more about filmmaking and specifically my style, I teach you everything you need to know in my Gorilla Filmmaker platform through my specialized courses that are going to catapult you from beginner to pro in no time. From my techniques, hacks and tricks, filming methodology and approach, and everything between gear, coloring, sound design, VFX, this is the definitive online filmmaker platform for you. Make sure to check it out and get 15% off at gorillafilmmaker.com, and if my work inspires you, then make sure to join me and become a Gorilla Filmmaker yourself. And with that said, let's fire up After Effects and let's get started. So here we have our main VFX composition, which includes the Keyblade summon and the ground burst. First, let's take a look at the Keyblade summon because it's very interesting and kind of fast to pull off. So what we have here, if I isolate my camera clips, is the move without a Keyblade, and then all of a sudden the Keyblade appears. But if you focus, guys, if you go frame by frame, you can see a slight misalignment happening to the background. That's because we spliced two clips into one to create this effect. Now here's the cool part. If I isolate the camera clip and I extend it in time, kind of like bring it back, you will see exactly what happens. So we have the move happening in one go with no Keyblade, and the Keyblade is actually on the ground, just out of the shot. And what happens is once we do the move without the Keyblade, we simply take the Keyblade and on the same spot repeat the shot twice, once without and once with the Keyblade. What that ends up creating is the two shots in the same spot happening at the same time. So once we splice them together, and it's always good to splice them in the highest motion blur point of that move. So as you guys can see here, we have the arm going down, and right there with a lot of motion blur happening, boom, we introduce the other shot. You can either do this with a tripod or in this case with a handheld camera look, just someone holding it, and the trick is to open the properties of scale and position of your camera clip and simply align them together as close as possible. A cool trick to do is hit the T to bring up the opacity, put it down to 50 and then overlay them for a single frame. And then as you move them around, you can see that you can actually find the best point where everything aligns, in this case when it comes to the buildings and the character. And once you do this, and play through, boom. Now, it's not perfect, but it happens in a split second, and the effect is really cool to pull off because of how simple it is. So you guys can see, boom, no Keyblade, and then Keyblade. But of course, we're not gonna stop there. We're gonna take things to the next level by introducing some magic sparks, some light effects, and distortion map when that Keyblade actually appears. So how do we actually do that? When we go to Make Big Films and we download our awesome asset, in this case, this Magic Sparks number 5, if I play them through, you can see that they're a light-based effect. What that means is that technically, they should affect the character and a bit of the foreground when they burst out, but in terms of the light, right? But currently, nothing really is happening. So the way to do this is to create an adjustment layer and just for a few seconds, for a few frames, apply a light-based effect. Now, before we do that, I want to talk to you about a bit about the sparks. Now, I have the asset, the pre-rendered asset dropped in, and then I placed it in my scene. What I did then, if I hit P, I simply animated 3 frames its position. So when the Keyblade is about to appear, I put the first frame. When it appears, I move them down by simply holding them and dragging them around in the scene to put them in space. And then the last one where the Keyblade kind of like has appeared and the sparks can all play through, I just left it there and let it just complete its animation. Now, a cool thing to do is when you actually manually move pre-rendered assets is to enable motion blur. And the way you do this, if you don't see it here, is toggle the switch and modes, enable motion blur, and then enable it in your composition as well. What this does, if I go back, you can see here, is actually incorporates motion blur depending on how much you move those assets around. And this is something that is going to make it look just a bit better. Lastly, when it comes to the animated asset, we can always manipulate the colors. In this case, I went to Effects, Color Correction, and hit Hue and Saturation. The way I do this, because if I click the master hue and just start flipping it around, you can see I can simply swap the color out and also control its saturation. The higher the value, more saturated, the lower saturation it has. Now, in this case, I opted for kind of like a gold spark color because within our scene, we have those nice yellow accent colors, and I thought that this would fit quite well. So if I play this through, we have the Keyblade summon as well as the sparks happening. But as I said that before, we don't have the character be affected by light. So the way we do this is we go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, just as I have over here, guys. And if you right-click, you can rename them so that you know what happens after a few of those come into play. Then I go to my masks, I drag this down and select the ellipse tool. And then I create a nice mask roughly around the character and this part of the image where the sparks take place. Then if I hit F in the keyboard, I bring up the mask feathering value, and depending on your resolution, this value can change. But in this case, I just want a nice gradual fall off of the effect instead of a sharp edge when the mask ends. So I put a value of 500. Then I change the blending mode to screen, and then I go to Effects, Color Correction, and select Curves, which is right on top here. Then what I did is I increased the value a little bit, and then I tried to match the colors of that gold sparks by controlling the individual colors. So for example, the blue, if you drag it down, it makes things more yellow. The red, if you drag it up, it makes things more red. So playing around with the individual curves, red, green, and blue, you can match the color of the light spill that the pre-rendered asset would actually do. So lastly, we hit T to bring up the opacity, and we hit the keyframes to take it from 0 to 100 when the sparks animation is at its brightest point, and then we simply animate the opacity out as the sparks die out as well. What this does is create this very nice kind of like flash of light that gradually fades away as the sparks fade away as well. And that just helps boost the realism of what is going on visually. Another cool thing is to go to Layer, New, Solid, make it white, and then trim it down to only last a singular frame like so. Then if you hit T to bring up the opacity, you can make it something like 25% or 50%, but what that will end up doing is for a single frame, it will fill the entire frame with a flash of light. If you want this to take it to the absolute max, the last thing to do is to include a distortion effect. Basically, you distort the space where the summoning of the weapon takes place, and that just puts the overall feel of the image to like a Hollywood level. Now, the way to do this, and specifically the way that I do this, is I use Video Copilot's Heat Distortion effect, which is a third-party plugin. You can do a similar effect using the built-in turbulent displays, but I want to show you guys exactly what the techniques that I use with the tools that help me bring the best out of my work. So let's take a look at how to use heat distortion. First, we create an adjustment layer, name it distortion, and then we trim it to start when the actual effect takes place. Then we apply the heat distortion effect by going to Effects, Video Copilot, and heat distortion. Now, you can select between fire, smoke, and incendiary. I always tend to go for smoke because I find the distortion quality is the best and most kind of like realistic, but you can always play around. And this is the key term here, play around. As you can see, I selected my distortion to be 7 in terms of the amount, heat amount 5, noise scale 500, and wind speed 2, which basically means how fast is the distortion happening through the timeline. But all of these values will heavily change depending on your shot. Different environment, different focal length, what's in front, what's the subject, and things that are happening, what the effect itself is. So what I don't want you guys to do is just to copy the values, but actually understand the thinking and methodology behind them. So always have some fun and spend the time to play around with these settings to find out what fits your scene the most. The key thing to keep in mind is that introduce the effect when the actual animation takes place, and then always you have to animate the effect dying out as the time passes by. And the way you do this is you hit those keyframes for the distortion amount and heat amount, and if I press U on my keyboard, you can see what happens to the layer itself. And right about here, I want it to actually stop affecting it. So from 7 and 5, I animate it down to almost nothing. We're talking about like 0.8 to 0.6. And that's because we're going to cut at that point to the next shot. When you combine all this together, you have an amazing weapon summon effect. Now, let's move on to another super cool shot, which is the ground explosion effect. If we play this through, this is actually, again, very easy to do and very straightforward using the Mavic Films pre-rendered assets. What I have here is actually a tripod locked off shot. The reason why I did this is because I didn't want to have to burden myself in post-production when it comes to a handheld camera motion and animate the whole ground bursting by having to track the floor. Whereas I'm going to show you at the very end how even though we had tripod shot, how at the end we end up with a nice moving scene. So back to our ground explosion, we have our main clip right here and just acting out a few Keyblade twists and then hitting the floor. The moment we hit the floor, we come in and we bring the ground explosion slow motion from Mavic Films asset and we drag it in. So Keyblade goes down, ground starts exploding. Now, a few things to keep in mind, guys. Because we locked it down on a tripod, we have no tracking to do. So if I hit the asset and I start moving it around, what I have to do is position the asset somewhere that makes sense. Once I did this and I can leave this kind of like play out, you can see that it fits very well in space. And a few things to keep in mind is the light direction of your captured scene in relation to the light direction of the asset you bring in place. Because sometimes you might have to flip things around, kind of like rotate them to make them match. But more importantly, the top thing that you need to match is the contrast, the colors, and the sharpness of a pre-rendered asset. And this is what we're going to take a deep dive in right now. So we brought our awesome pre-rendered asset, we positioned it in place and where it makes sense, and now this is what we end up with. Not really fitting, is it? But this is how it's supposed to be. So you start with the levels adjustment. Effect, color correction, levels. And if I open this one here, you can see that I started manipulating my shadows and my highlights and my midtones to start basically matching what my real captured recording looks like to this one. Once I'm kind of like happy and I feel like I'm close when it comes to the contrast, I move on to the coloring. So I like to go to effects, color correction, hue and saturation. And what I try to do is open this up and kind of like start playing around with the yellows, with the greens, with the blues. As you guys can see here, mine 75 versus full, and try to gradually getting closer and closer to how my clip looks. Now, I know that originally, when I captured this, I used a LUT profile in the camera to get this shot. So I brought it in and I simply applied it to my asset as well. And now we're getting even closer because the same LUT that was used during the camera recording is applied to the asset as well. Now this step depends, of course, if you used LUTs on the day. But again, the thinking is the same. Start manipulating the colors to get it as close as it is in your original recording. Then another curves adjustment, kind of like taking the blues down, as you guys can see here, just to introduce more yellow, bringing the red tones a bit up versus holding them down, and so forth. Now, a very cool effect that can help you is called tritone. So if you go to color correction and you select tritone, you're introduced with this. And you have a highlights, midtones, and shadows option. The way you do this is you select a highlights point, a midtone point, like the actual ground, right? And then a shadows, like let's say this wall over here, just like I've done right there with these three colors. And when that does is actually mapping them out to your asset. You can always blend it with the original a bit, depending on how strong or not the effect is, to get it even closer. And now we're basically there. Like this looks really, really good compared to the original before any colorization. And then with our effects, it looks really good. If you guys remember, I also mentioned sharpness though. So if I take this off, you can see our recording and we have a bit of depth of field happening over here and the primary focus being on the character right in the center. If I bring in the asset, this is a very high quality asset, and as you can see, it's actually a bit too sharp in relation to our recording. And this is something that I see a lot of people getting wrong, is they always forget to match the sharpness of the assets composed in comparison to what the original real-life recording was. But it's a very easy fix, guys. If you go to effects and select blur and sharpen, and then you select camera lens blur, just as I have done right here, when we bring it in, you can see that very easily we can control the blur radius to something, in this case 1.5, and really make the pre-rendered asset less sharp. The numerical value would depend on what your recording is, right? So if I go to 5, for example, it's just overkill. Play around to really match what your recording and what your shot does in relation to the effects that you apply. So now, if we go back and we play this through, we have the nice ground bursting, and again, the colors really fit, the sharpness fits, and the scene overall makes sense, right? Lastly, what we need to do now is animate this composition so it has a bit more energy when it comes to the movement, because we selected to go with a tripod shot just to make our lives easier when it came to post-production and composing this asset in. So if I go back to my original VFX comp over here, the shot is actually now moving with the same kind of like handheld motion as the shot before. The way you do this is super cool, is you simply animate the position of the scene. The way you do this is you select the composition and you hit P to bring up the position. Then press Alt and you hit the keyframe. What this is going to do is open up an expressions tab. In this case, I put in this simple expression, wiggle, parenthesis 2, 25, which is the amount. So basically 2 is the rate of the movement happening. The second one, 25, is how many pixels is going to be shifted. And lastly, 1 is just an extra value to kind of like give it a bit more diversity when it comes to the movement. And now with this in place, you can actually see the layer as it's moving around in place. Now, of course, when you do this, you're going to have to crop in a bit. And if you select S, you're going to bring up the scale. In this case, we'd put it at 104 because that covers the whole animation of the clip in terms of move. But what you're left out now with that simple effect is boom, this. We have a nice kind of like handheld look followed from the previous shot, even though we shot this on a tripod and we were super easy to composing the ground effect. Okay guys, so this is a wrap for this tutorial. Let me guys know what you thought in the comment section below, and of course make sure to check out the awesome guys at the amazing Make Big Films VFX platform. And if you want to become a guerrilla filmmaker, then join me with 15% off at guerrillafilmmaker.com, and let's get started.